Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us today. It's been a long mission for the Special Rapporteur, and a long day as well. So we really appreciate your patience. Some of you have been here since, or are here since 10 o'clock, 10:30 this morning. If you're joining us online or if you're joining us online on Zoom or in the room, you should have the option for both English and Arabic, also asking questions via the chat box. It is my understanding that Mr. Shooter will brief some of you separately following his address, and he will also be happy to answer a few questions after he concludes. صباح الخير أيها السيدات والسادة، أشكر انضمامكم لهذا المؤتمر الصحفي اليوم لاختتام زيارة المقرر الخاص إلى لبنان. إذا كنتم تنضمون إلينا عبر الإنترنت أو في هذه القاعة، ستجدون خيار المتابعة باللغتين الإنجليزية والعربية. سيوجز المقرر الخاص بعض الوسائل الإعلامية بشكل خاص عند نهاية المؤتمر، كما سيسعده الإجابة على بعض الأسئلة عبر هذه المنصة بعد أن يختتم حديثه. سيد شوتر، الكلمة لك. Monsieur Shooter, the floor is yours.
Stop.
Thank you. This would work. This works? Right.
Yes.
So again, very warm welcome to all, and many thanks for attending this press briefing. I have been appointed by the United Nations Human Rights Council as Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights to inquire about the situation of poverty in the world, and I do this inter alia by country visits, such as the one I've been doing in Lebanon over the past 2 weeks. I've been invited by the government of Lebanon to listen, to watch. We are sometimes referred to as the eyes and ears of the international community. And my role is then to report back both to the government and to the international community about the state of poverty and about what can be done concerning the situation to remedy it. I benefited in this visit from an exceptional level of cooperation of the Lebanese government, and I'm extremely grateful to the Foreign Affairs Ministry of Lebanon and to all the actors I met for their extremely helpful cooperation. I met 9 ministers, 9 members of the government. I met with Prime Minister Mikati, and I'm extremely grateful that they all agreed to enter into a dialogue with me. This situation that Lebanon is facing is unprecedented. The country is facing 4 crises that are now converging. First, there is the crisis resulting from the arrival of Syrian refugees. Since 2011, about 1.5 million refugees, including more than 800,000 registered before 2015 by UNHCR, and 88% live in extreme poverty, despite the support provided to them by the UNHCR in the form of cash assistance, 800,000 lira per household, plus 300,000 per family member for roughly 75–80% of the most destitute families of Syrian refugees. The appeal of the UNHCR for 2021, however, has not been responded to by the donors as it should. The appeal was for $550 million, and UNHCR received only 260 million for this year. The second crisis is a result, of course, of the fall of the Lebanese pound. resulting from a decline of foreign exchange inflows since 2011 and the trade balance deficit. This has led to massive inflation, about 400% for food items between 2019 and 2021. It has led to a general impoverishment of the population in the country, especially for those who are only receiving money in lira. And it results in children not being able to go to school, being put to work. The rates of early child marriage are increasing as a result. 400,000 children in 2020 were unable to go to school due to poverty. Thirdly, there is, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic that has been hitting the country like others. As a result, the school dropout rates have further increased, and many children cannot follow online courses because they have no electricity, because they don't have access to the internet, and the school closures, therefore, have had a severe impact on access to education. Fourth and finally, of course, there is the impact of the Beirut port blast of 4th of August 2020 that has led to a large number of people being made homeless and to about 70,000 people losing their jobs. These are important crises, and the government is facing an unprecedented set of difficulties. However, behind these four crises, there is another crisis, which is to be underlined, and that is a crisis of trust. People do not believe the state is able or even willing to assist them to go through this unprecedented situation that the population is facing. And when I told many people about my mission, when I spoke to families who are destitute in Burj in Tripoli, in Baalbek, they often answered, "Ma fi dawli," there is no state. They have lost confidence in the ability of the state to provide a response. And so the question today is first, how to protect people at risk? And the other question is how to restore confidence, how to restore trust in the government's ability to react. Let me deal with these two questions in turn. First, what are the populations most at risk? I'd like to start by the stateless persons in the country who have not been able to register and do not have a legal status in the country, cannot register their children to ensure access to employment and education. And that is a first group that is indeed particularly badly affected in the current circumstances. The second group are the Syrian and Palestinian refugees. Syrian refugees, as I said, about 1.5 million, only rarely have legal residency status. 16% approximately have this status. Few are able to obtain work permits in a limited range of sectors: agriculture, construction, cleaning, garbage collection. And therefore, very often they are relegated to informal work and they are dependent on humanitarian support. Now, since the economic crisis started 2 years ago, competition for jobs with Lebanese has increased. Scapegoating is becoming a national sport. I heard many families complaining that the Syrian refugees would be better treated by UNHCR than the government treats the Lebanese population. And unfortunately, I heard this also from the highest levels of government. Discrimination against Syrian refugees has also increased. However, it's important to note that today many sectors are understaffed because doctors, engineers, architects are leaving the country in large numbers. And in my view, it would be entirely justified to improve access to employment for Syrian refugees. The decision to return to Syria, as many studies show, is not primarily a decision motivated by the socio-economic conditions these populations face in Lebanon. Acquiring better qualifications by work will allow these people to contribute to the reconstruction of Syria when they can return, and access to employment is a human right that should be guaranteed without discrimination. I also mentioned the Palestinian refugees. about 280,000 are in the country, although the figures are difficult to estimate with any precision. These refugees are excluded from some 39 syndicated professions, despite the current brain drain that the country is facing. They live in desperate conditions. Even when they work in the formal sector, they contribute to the National Social Security Fund for the equivalent of about 23.5% of their wages, and yet they only receive in return an end-of-service indemnity equivalent to 8.5% of the paid value. In other terms, they're still treated as foreign workers coming from a country with which Lebanon has no reciprocity agreement, despite the fact that they live in the country since 3 generations. A third group that I would like to mention are the migrant workers. About 200,000 migrant workers work as domestic workers in this country. They are trapped often under the kafala system, one that ties them to one particular employer. And this results in many cases in abuse, in their passports being confiscated, in their wages not being paid, and in physical abuse and harassment. I'm delighted that the Minister of Labor, whom I met, Mr. Mustafa Bayram, committed to move towards the revised standard unified contract in order to improve the protection of migrant domestic workers once the Shura Council will have approved that standard unified contract. Fourthly, I'd like to mention women. Women in Lebanon are overworked and underpaid. They're overworked because they contribute on average 5 hours of unremunerated and unrecognized work within the household, and they're underpaid. Their wages on average are 34% of those of men. Women face today increased abuse within the household. We've seen a rise of gender-based violence as a result of poverty increases. They are also facing abuse in the workplace. They do not dare to leave their jobs because of the fears caused by the economic crisis, even though they may be subject to harassment or discrimination. The government, in my view, should improve access to employment for women and should address urgently the gender pay gap. Finally, I'd like to mention persons with disabilities, and I met quite a few of them during my visit. About 75% of those persons with disabilities who are capable of working are not finding work because of discrimination. And unfortunately, the law that is meant to protect them, Law 220 of 2000, is still largely unimplemented. Secondly, I'd like to address the question of how to restore trust in the country. Here, I would like to start by noting that the political system should recover its integrity. And that is true in particular with respect to the banking sector that was responsible for the downfall of the lira and therefore for the impoverishment of the Lebanese population. In 2014, according to a study published then, 43% of the assets of commercial banks were controlled by people affiliated with the political elites. 18 out of 20 banks had major shareholders linked to political elites, and 8 families controlled 29% of the banking sector's assets. This is why journalists refer to Lebanon as becoming a bankocracy. And we need urgently, I believe, to prevent conflicts of interests between the business sector and politicians. Otherwise, there is a very real risk that Lebanon becomes a rentier state, a state, in other terms, that is captured by economic interests in order to reinforce the economic dominance of the major economic actors. In this regard, I have to say I met with great interest with Judge Georges Attier leading the central inspection. And I believe the work of the central inspection could be further strengthened and supported, just as Lebanon should implement its anti-corruption strategy 2020 2025. The second point I'd like to make concerns access to social protection for the Lebanese population. In Lebanon, there is essentially no welfare state. There is, of course, the major cash transfer program, the National Poverty Targeting Program, launched in 2011, and that covers today some 36,000 households who are provided some $126 per month per household. The government has the plan to expand the NPTP to some 75,000 households, but that would still cover only about 1/10 of the Lebanese population, despite the fact that impoverishment is general across all population groups. So the government has now committed to build on the NPTP to develop the emergency social safety net, to cover with World Bank financing for about $246 million, some 160,000 families. And finally, there are plans to introduce the ration card that should cover some 500,000 households with a financing of about $556 million US. Now, these are all laudable and important efforts, but they are not a substitute for robust social protection systems that protect people from poverty. The first reason for this is that these programs are not well targeted. I met many families who are not benefiting from the National Poverty Targeting Program, the NPTP, because they did not know how to register, because they were not seen as qualifying for the program, and they have sometimes not applied because they do not trust that registration will be objective, and they fear that it will be based instead on political affiliation. This can be improved, and the introduction of the impact platform that was experimented for the distribution of the COVID-19 vaccines is indeed good news, although I express my concern that if registration is only online via the impact platform, it may exclude a large number of people in poverty who have no access to internet, who have no electricity, and who have no digital literacy, allowing them to apply only through online registration. But the second problem is more important. Lebanon cannot continue to rely for its social protection programs on donor money alone. Now, of course, the international community has lots of sympathy for Lebanon. And many people told me they're friends of Lebanon and they want to help, and so do I. Indeed, I was very encouraged to hear from my interlocutors within the government that there was now a consensus with the position of the Lebanese government in its dialogue with the IMF, that the important losses of the banking sector should be met by the shareholders of banks and by the large depositors, rather than imposing haircuts on small depositors. And that is very positive news. This is what the Minister of Finance told me, Dr. Youssef Khalil. This is what the Minister of Economy and Trade told me, Amin Salam. And this is also what I heard from the governor of the Bank of Lebanon, the central bank, Mr. Riyad Salameh. All these actors are part of the negotiating team with the IMF, and I'm optimistic that these talks are making good progress. However much the international community can help, however much humanitarian assistance should be provided, and however much the IMF bailout can support the country in the short term, this is not a substitute for mobilizing domestic resources in order to adopt and implement a national strategy for social protection. Lebanon can achieve this. Lebanon is one of the most unequal countries on the planet. Some 10% of the wealthiest in the population own 70% of total wealth. And despite this, Lebanon has a highly regressive taxation system. 40% of the public revenue of the Lebanese government comes from indirect taxes, consumption taxes, VAT taxes that have a regressive impact on the poor. There is in this country no wealth tax, there is no inheritance tax. Only 11% of the tax revenue of the country is collected through progressive schemes. And even there, since different sources of income are counted separately rather than added to one another, the system is not quite as progressive as it could. There is therefore fiscal space that does allow country to mobilize resources to finance much more sustainably social protection for the benefit of the Lebanese population. And this is a strong recommendation I would like to address to the government. Thirdly, we discussed in our talks with the Lebanese government the important issue of the minimum wage. Today, the minimum wage is set at 675,000 Lebanese lira per month. That is a pitiful amount. It is absolutely not in line with the increased costs of living over the past 2 or 3 years. And indeed, that minimum wage was set lastly in 2017. I was reassured to hear from the Minister of Labor, Mr. Mustafa Baram, that the tripartite index committee would very soon increase the level of the minimum wage. I think this is important and positive news. Fourth and finally, I was delighted to meet with Dr. Walid Fayyad, the Minister of Energy and Water, and we discussed in that context the challenge of providing electricity to the Lebanese population. Today, Électricité du Liban is highly inefficient. Indeed, even working at full capacity, which it is not, it would only cover some 63% of the needs of the population in energy, and EDL is extremely costly, and so reforms are much needed. However, we discussed 2 issues with Minister Fayyad. The first one was the social tariff that should be introduced in order to accompany the unbundling of Électricité du Liban. In other terms, it's privatization and the increase in tariffs to allow Électricité du Liban to cease losing money. And the second issue we discussed was the establishment of the Independent Electricity Regulatory Authority, which was planned to be established almost 20 years ago under law number 462, which Minister Fayyad committed to set up, and which, in my view, should be set up soon in order to allow it to supervise the concession of the electricity services to private companies. I'd like to close here. These are the main recommendations I made and presented to government. The dialogue, of course, will continue. I will present my final report to the Human Rights Council in June 2022. I reiterate my thanks to the government for facilitating this visit. This country is being put to the test. The population is facing unprecedented challenges. Impoverishment is widespread. I saw scenes in Lebanon that I had not imagined I would ever see in a middle-income country, and many hopes are put in the administration of Prime Minister Mikhati. Those hopes should not be disappointed. This is the last chance government. C'est le gouvernement de la dernière chance. This is not yet a failed country, but the country is failing, and the government, until now, has not been able to reassure its population that it will work in the public interest. Many thanks indeed.
Thank you, Mr. De Shooter. I would like to quickly remind you that the mission statement and the mission report are currently being published online, and we will also be circulating them to you all. You have submitted your emails, I believe, to my colleague, and we will make sure all of you will have a copy of that online, I mean a soft copy. I believe Mr. Shooter will be taking a few questions now. I do encourage you to introduce yourselves before asking the question. شكرا سيدتي وسادتي. أذكركم أن البيان الصحفي، البيان الختامي والتقرير الختامي لهذه الزيارة سوف يتم نشره على على الويب سايت التابع للمقرر الخاص، وايضا نحن رح نتكفل انه نبعث لكم اياه على الايميل ادرسز اللي اعطيتونا اياها. رح ناخذ هلا بعد نفتح المجال لبعض الاسئله. بتمنى انه تعرفوا عن نفسكم قبل ما تطرحوا السؤال. شكرا. بذكر كمان انه رح نقدر ناخذ الاسئله اونلاين via the chat box. So we remind also everybody who is following us online that there will be a chance to ask questions via the chat box. Thank you. الجزيرة.
Zana Khadir, Al Jazeera. You speak about the interests between the banking sector and the politicians, and then you talk about unequal taxes, how the wealthy are not really taxed and it's the poor that carries the burden. I mean, explain to us what needs to be done on the part of the politicians who have been implementing these policies. I mean, do you have any faith that anything is going to change?
Well, thank you for your question. The government has no choice because it cannot infinitely rely on donor support, and the international donors whom I spoke to are just tired of waiting for reforms to be effectively implemented. We have strategies, we have action plans, we have commitments made, but reforms are still in the making and none has been adopted yet that convinces the international community that gradually Lebanon will move to a much more sustainable position in which domestic resources can finance public policies for the benefit of the population. The country cannot continue to rely on begging money from the international community, and therefore I think there is simply no choice. I can say that in my dialogue with the Minister of Public Finance, Mr. Youssef Khalil, he was understanding of the failures and the gaps in the taxation system in Lebanon. I mentioned that taxation was not sufficiently progressive. I also should add that tax collection is deeply inefficient. Only 40% of the taxes are effectively collected in this country. There is not enough that is done against tax avoidance and tax evasion. And so the country is a rich country that could do much more in support of the population if only there were more political will and if that were seen as a priority for the country. So I am hopeful this will be done. And the reason why I'm hopeful is because there is no choice but to improve things.
Thank you, Mr. Shooter. Some hard copies of both the mission report and the press release are currently being kindly distributed by my colleague Hala from the UN Information Center. And yeah, you're all invited to grab a copy. عم نوزع هلا نسخ من البيان الختامي والبيان الصحفي التقرير الختامي والبيان الصحفي لهذه الزيارة زميل من مركز الأمم المتحدة للانفورميشن للمعلومات عم بتساعدني انه نوزعهم. اوكي، بعد في اسئله بليز من القاعه. شكرا.
وائل طالب لريون Today newspaper. Did you speak with the cabinet representatives about the upcoming election? Did they give you a guarantee that it's going to happen?
No, I have not.
Thanks.
Thank you. هل في أسئلة أونلاين؟ بس بحب أسأل زميلتي، هل في أسئلة أونلاين؟ Are there any online questions yet? So we can perhaps alternate. Okay. We can take another question from the room.
الإنسان du monde. What is the difference for you between a failing state and a failed state? And at one point, will you declare Lebanon a failed state?
The government today is not able to function properly, in large part because the Council of Ministers has not been able to meet over the past few weeks for the reasons you are aware of. related both to the investigation of Judge Bitar on the Beirut blast and related to the crisis with the Gulf countries. That does not make things easy. And for all practical purposes, this government is like a caretaking government, unable to make strategic decisions. Yet the situation is urgent. And although Prime Minister Mikati, whom I met, and I discussed this with him, stated in his presidential address presented on 16th of September that the country is facing an unprecedented crisis, I did not have the impression that the full level of urgency had been grasped. So to me, this is le gouvernement de la dernière chance. If this administration, even before the elections, and even before the closure of the negotiations with the IMF, if this administration does not take immediate reforms, then yes, we may be failing Lebanon. We may be led to Lebanon becoming a failed state. And a failed state is one that has lost the capacity to support its population in times of crisis. Lebanon has this capacity still. The human resources in the country are fantastic. The level of education of the population is still very high. The resources are there if only they were mobilized for the public interest. But many people are now leaving the country. Taxation is not really affecting the rich, and resources are not mobilized in the interest of the population. So it's not a failed state, it's a failing state.
Thank you, Mr. Shooter. One more question.
عاطف بعلبكي next LB. سؤال بالعربية لو سمحتي. في حال سيدي الكريم، في حال لا في حكومة ولا انتخابات نيابية ولا انتخابات رئاسية، كيف تتعامل الأمم المتحدة مع هذا الواقع المفروض علينا؟
Thank you for your question. I am not representing the position of the United Nations system as a whole. I've been appointed by the United Nations Human Rights Council to report on poverty in the country, and therefore I will not address the question of the electoral calendar at all. Although I know it's a question of great interest to the Lebanese media, it is not something that falls under my mandate.
Thank you. Any other questions from the room? Yeah.
كمان بالعربي إذا أمكن. It's جوال حاج موسى from الحرة. تحدثت إلى مسؤولين في الحكومة اللبنانية ورئيس مجلس الوزراء، وقد أشرت إلى أنك تلقيت وعودا منهم بأنهم سيقومون بالإصلاحات اللازمة في القطاع المصرفي والضريبي وما إلى ذلك. كلها وعود، ولكن حتى الساعة الحكومة لا تجتمع بسبب مشكلة داخلية أثارها تصريح أحد الوزراء. نرى أن هناك شلل كامل في كافة القطاعات. ماذا قدموا غير الوعود إلى الأمم المتحدة لكي تصدق الدول المانحة أن لبنان فعلا سيقوم بهذه الإصلاحات؟
Thank you for this question. They have not provided anything else than promises. And that is precisely why we need now to move from words to action, from promises to effective change, from national action plans and strategies to reforms. And I repeat, this should not wait for the elections. This should not wait for the IMF negotiations to end because the patience of the donors has limits. And I spoke to donors who expressed to me very candidly their frustration with the lack of reform. So I know this is it's a young government. I know it's facing multiple crises. I know, of course, the government is not working together easily, but this is a reason why Prime Minister Mikati should exercise his authority and move the country forward. I think we have no time to lose.
Thank you. We have a question that was dropped in the chat box. Sorry. We have a question that was dropped online. Mr. Shooter, how can the international community expect reforms from the same political groups / people who led to the crisis due to their corruption and lack of political will to change. Isn't it time to put your hope and efforts somewhere else?
I wouldn't say this is a politically loaded question, but it looks like one. I believe the sense of urgency is now gradually increasing, and those who currently exercise responsibilities should look beyond the elections of 27th of March or of May, and they should ask how they will be judged for their action today at a time when the country is really at a crossroads. The country has become entirely dependent on donor support to implement policies in major areas, including for the reconstruction of the zones affected by the Beirut blast and for social protection. And that is simply not sustainable. It cannot last for many more years. And I think the government should look at indeed which reforms it could implement. I'm sorry to say that very often when I asked about the intentions of the government, I got two types of answers, some referring to the need for more aid, more international support, and others referring to the Syrian refugees as having to take the blame for the situation the country is facing. And that to me is an extremely worrying trend I've heard in Lebanon from people, from politicians that are scapegoating Syrian refugees, blaming it on the refugees, the situation of the country. I believe this is not a way out of the crisis to put the blame on those refugees, and the government should look at what it can do for its population.
Thank you. I would just like to mention that this question was actually asked by the Lebanese Center for Political Studies. So thank you for following us online. Another question coming up online as well, but I would like to see if there are questions from the room first, or shall we take another question online? Okay, so the question is, if Lebanon fails, do you expect more people trying to flee to Europe? From Jan Kuhlman.
Look, very clearly, immigration is not a new thing for Lebanon. There's a very important Lebanese diaspora, and we have many friends of Lebanese origin in my own country, for example. And the diaspora provides, unfortunately, maybe an essential lifeline for the Lebanese population in times of crisis, at least for those who have relatives abroad. But today, we have indeed an increase of immigration, of brain drain. The embassies have been overwhelmed by the demand for visas, and indeed the demand for passports has increased significantly. And even worse, I spoke to young children in some parts of the country, particularly in Akkar, in Tripoli, and these young children, 10, 11, 12 years old, are speaking of leaving the country themselves. This is something of great concern because the one asset of this country is its human capital. It's been traditionally a country that has produced extraordinarily well-trained professionals, doctors, engineers, architects, lawyers. And these are the ones now who are leaving the country. And I'm extremely worried by this trend because it is the main capital of the country that is now leaving. And that's far more important even than foreign exchange reserves.
Thank you, Mr. De Schutter. Any questions from the floor here before I take another question online that was posed by the Telegraph newspaper, Campbell McDiarmid. I hope I got her name or his name right. Question for Mr. De Schutter. You said you saw scenes in Lebanon you had not expected you would ever see in a middle-income country. What was the most striking scene of poverty you witnessed? Please. Thank you.
Well, you know, I remember this woman. I I met in a very poor family in a poor neighborhood of Tripoli, and she told me, the situation I'm facing is so difficult that I wish I were an animal. I met many people who feel entirely abandoned by the state, who fell in tears when I asked them to describe to me the situation they were facing. Now, this in a very poor country that has no resources, that has no institutions, a failed state indeed, could be expected. But in Lebanon, with the wealth this country has, with the high level of education it can boast, with the splendid symbol that Lebanon has been for so many years, almost a century, that is simply unacceptable. And that is indeed completely unprecedented. And to me, was a huge surprise.
Thank you, Mr. De Schutter. I suggest we take 3 to 4 questions max, because we want to give some time to Mr. Schutter to be able to take some time off before his exclusive interviews. So we have a question by the, actually this one is by the Lebanese Center for Political Studies. My apologies, because the first one was actually asked by by the Adyan Foundation. So the correct question that is attributed to the LCPS is the following: have you studied the feasibility of applying the 3R framework, i.e. balancing donors, government, and civil society organization representatives to a larger international recovery efforts? We did, yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. So the 3RF, the framework for reform, reconstruction, and recovery is an important guide for governmental action. And I'm very delighted that Prime Minister Mihati continues to refer to this framework, because it attempts to bridge the short-term humanitarian response with long-term development of the country. And that bridge is very important to make for the reasons I already mentioned. We cannot remain focused on the humanitarian response alone. Moreover, the 3RF, the Reform, Reconstruction and Recovery Framework, is one that contains a number of important promises, including the abolition of the kafala system, the strengthening of human rights institutions, and the increase of the minimum wage, for example. So I welcome the fact that this framework is guiding the action of the government. I welcome the fact that NGOs have a very important role in monitoring the implementation of the framework. I note that donors refer to this framework as an important signpost for the government, and indeed it expresses the hope of the international community that the money it puts into the country is going to be put to good use for the benefit of the population. And that this is accompanied by reforms. Now, let me be, again, as crystal clear as I can. I know that the government is waiting for more donor commitments from the World Bank, for example, to finance the emergency social safety net, and maybe later the ration card, from the IMF following negotiations. Humanitarian actors have joined efforts under OCHA's leadership to present the Lebanon emergency response plan. But again, these are not a substitute for long-term development and the reforms that will allow the country to stand on its own footing. And it is that bridge that the 3RF framework seeks to provide. I hope that this 3RF framework, although it was not initially designed by the government alone, rather it came from the EU, the World Bank, and the UNDP and the UN system, I hope that it can be owned gradually by the government, and that the Lebanese government will continue to refer to it as a guide for its action.
Thank you, Mr. De Schutter. I was just informed that the press release in both English and Arabic was posted on Mr. De Schutter's official website, srpoverty.org, and that the end of mission statement is also online in English so far on the same website. I have a question from Gareth Brown, The National. Did poverty issues related to climate change come up during your fieldwork? In particular, are a lack of access to clean drinking water and other climate-linked causes of poverty like to feature in your report to the Human Rights Council? Or likely to feature in your report to the Human Rights Council?
Yes, well, thank you for this question from The National. I'm very deeply attached to the question of environmental degradation because I know, like you know, that people in poverty are the most affected by the failure to address environmental degradation effectively. People in poverty do not choose where they live. They go where the rents are lowest, where houses are cheap. And unfortunately, in Lebanon, this often means living where garbage is not properly collected and where landfills are dumped or waste is dumped in landfills in ways that are affecting the health condition of people. I was in Burj Hamoud, in the outskirts of Beirut, and I was really struck by the odor, the smell from the landfill in Burj Hamoud. I was also struck, of course, as you all are when you travel across Lebanon, by the situation of garbage collection affecting the health of the population. These are issues that will be in my final report. I had a very good meeting at the Ministry of the Environment where we two issues, the air pollution affecting respiratory health, and we also discussed the impact of landfills on the health of the population. This is just one example you see of public services being underfunded and inefficiently run. And of course, people in poverty are the first victims of this.
Thank you. Thank you. I have, I'll take two more questions. Any questions from the room, from the floor? No. So I'll take two more questions. One of them from Legal Agenda, Ines Shiri. Allow me to ask the question in the original language, in Arabic. لم تذكر شيئا عن القطاع لم تذكر شيئا عن القطاع الصحي الذي ينهار والجهات الضامنة لم تعد قادرة على تغطية المواطنين والدعم رفع عن عدد كبير من الأدوية. هل هناك أي توصيات في هذا الصدد وهل التقيت مع وزارة الصحة؟
So it is correct that I did not have time to refer to the health sector. I did meet with the Minister of Public Health, Firas El Abiad. It was a very good meeting, and I know how respected he is in this country for his work on combating the COVID-19 pandemic in his former role. That meeting was highly productive. We did discuss the question of access to medicines. Medicines are one of the items that Lebanon must import from abroad, like it must import wheat and fuel. And as a result of the gradual removal of subsidies, some medicines may be out of reach of many poor households in Lebanon. And we discussed this as a very serious challenge the government was facing. I will dedicate a full paragraph to these issues in my final report, but unfortunately, there was not enough time to incorporate this in my end of mission statement now. But thank you for alerting me to this aspect of the question of poverty in Lebanon.
Thank you, Mr. De Schutter. I will take just a couple more questions because we're running out of time. So there's a question from EFE, the Spanish Agency for News. Ana Maria Guezlian from the Spanish News Agency. Do you believe the high-rank politicians who are blaming Syrian refugees for Lebanon's economic crisis or begging for more aid instead of implementing actual social system change will be able to fulfill the promises they gave you, Mr. De Schutter? Thank you.
Inshallah, I can only hope that the promises will not remain promises and that reforms will be implemented. my visit is really an opportunity to send a wake-up call to the government. It is, I think, 5 to midnight. And I think we should not wait for the elections to implement these reforms, and that after 13 months of caretaking government, we now need to provide the Lebanese population with the reforms it requires. And indeed, I repeat that blaming the troubles of the country on the Syrian refugees or calling upon help from the international community shall not be a substitute for substantive reforms that the country now urgently needs. And that, in fact, donors need to see implemented in order for them to have trust in the government's ability to deliver on its promises.
Okay, the last three questions I promised, Mr. Olivier. So it's from Omar Tamo, a financial reporter at Forbes Middle East. He's asking the following: top officials vowed several reforms. However, many, if not most Lebanese, do not believe their pledges. What guarantees did officials give to reform? What is the probability, in your belief, to turn those promises into action?
I believe the government is gradually becoming awake to the realities that the country is facing, and that my interlocutors have gradually come to understand the expectations addressed to the government. We are still waiting for reforms to be implemented. We are still hoping for promises to be fulfilled. But it is now or never. If nothing is done within the next 3 or 4 months, it will be very difficult not only to maintain trust, but even to make up for the enormous depletion of human capital that is currently taking place, with school dropouts and people leaving the country en masse to escape the crisis. And we will not be able to restore trust in the ability of public institutions to deliver for the benefit of the population. So I would like to thank Omar Tuma for these questions, but it's not questions that should be addressed to me. These are questions he, as a journalist, should address to the government.
Thank you, Mr. De Schutter. So Rinwa, we already answered your question. Rinwa is a non-resident fellow on public health with the Tahrir Institute of Middle East Policy. She asked a question also about related to the healthcare system in Lebanon, which you already answered. So we may skip to the last question. The Arab NGO Network for Development is asking you, Mr. Olivier, you said that privatization was discussed in the electricity sector. Do you think that this is a solution for the sector, or will lead to tariff increase, I think tax increase, consequently further impact on people? Thank you.
I think privatization is fraught with dangers. And my predecessor, Professor Philip Alston, my esteemed predecessor as Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, did a full report on the risks entailed with privatization. Private companies are motivated by maximizing profits rather than by providing welfare to the population. And so we must be extremely attentive to the impact on people in poverty of privatization processes. And we should not forget that selling state assets is a one-time solution that may provide some solace in the short term for public finance, but is not a long-term answer to the country's qualms. The privatization of electricity du Liban has already started, in fact, and Minister Walid Fayad, who's supervising the next steps, has explained to me how he intended to ensure that people in poverty would not be negatively impacted by the reforms that are currently being implemented, both privatization and the raising of tariffs, because today people pay almost nothing per kilowatt, maybe 5 or 8 cents per kilowatt, when the real cost of the electricity provided is much higher. His answer was that in the future tariff increases, those consuming less would pay less per kilowatt. Those consuming more would pay more per kilowatt. However, this is not a fully convincing answer, particularly because if you increase tariffs for everyone, even though they will increase less for people who consume less, people in poverty may still be affected in the absence of a social tariff. And a social tariff means that people who are identified as poor, and they shall be identified thus by cash transfer programs such as the NPTP or the Emergency Social Safety Net, they should pay less per kilowatt than people who are better off. It's true that many people today pay for private generators electricity that is much more expensive, but people in poverty only can afford these 2 hours of electricity they have thanks to Électricité du Liban. They do not have the money allowing them to pay for private generators. And so for them, the risks are indeed real. So I would like to thank the Arab network of NGOs for development for their question, and I'm very attentive to this question.
Thank you, Mr. De Schutter. So it's a wrap, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for attending this press conference. Those of you who have booked exclusive interviews with Mr. De Schutter will be able to meet with him on the 6th floor in the business center of the hotel. Thank you very much.
Avec plaisir.
So sorry, it's the -2 floor. ناقص 2 مش السادس sorry.
So then it's not the business lounge.
Yeah. Au business lounge.
Ils ont changé la salle. Non, c'était très très utile. Ça va, j'ai ça. Il n'y a pas beaucoup d'énergie.